I'd like to ask you to spare me a few minutes of your time, because there's something I'd like to say, something I'd like to put on the record. When slavery was at its height, the middle classes around the world just refused to talk about it. They ignored the misery and suffering that was going on all around them. In Mississippi, the governor's wife would hold a scented handkerchief to her face as she walked past the slave pens on the way to church. In Baghdad, sheikhs would hold forth on the compassion and mercy of Allah whilst being served iced tea by slaves who had been castrated so they couldn't fiddle with Muslim women. Now, why they acted this way, who can say? Perhaps it was because they'd been brought up with slavery and it was just part of normal behaviour, part of the furniture. Or perhaps it was a case of what the psychologists refer to as denial, where people refuse to face up to unwelcome truths. Or possibly they just realised that it was politically unwise to raise the issue. But whatever the truth, one thing is for certain, and that is that there was an awful lot of hypocrisy involved. Well, today, a trade is being conducted that is far more abusive, far more exploitative, and far more lethal than the slave trade ever was. And the trade I'm referring to is the heroin trade. The heroin trade is also conducted on a much larger scale than slavery ever was. According to the UN, there are between 20 and 30 million people around the world addicted to heroin. In my country, Britain, otherwise known as the heroin capital of the Western world, we have approximately 400,000 people addicted to heroin. That's the equivalent of a city the size of Liverpool, all on heroin. We have twice as many retail outlets for heroin as we do for petrol, and nearly half of all the prisoners in our jails have to be put on methadone to stabilise their heroin addiction. But you would never guess that we had such an enormous problem if you listened to our politicians or our journalists or our priests, because they just don't talk about it. They just ignore the issue. They're more than happy to lecture us on the evils of tobacco and alcohol. They might even mention marijuana and cocaine. But the word heroin very rarely passes their lips. It's as if someone has issued a fatwa on the very use of the word. But the greatest tragedy is that this particular trade could so easily be abolished. The vast majority of the world's heroin, around 90% according to the UN, comes from Afghanistan. Afghanistan devotes 16,000 hectares of prime agricultural land to cultivating the poppy, from which they harvest about 10,000 tonnes of opium annually. They import 14,000 tonnes of chemicals, which they use to convert the opium into heroin, and they end up with a massive 360 tonnes of pure heroin, 30 tonnes of which finds its way to my country. And this enormous commercial activity is conducted quite openly and conducted right under the noses of our forces there, who have the capacity to completely destroy the heroin trade. We have drone aircraft capable of being used for crop spraying. We have modern herbicides which could completely degrade the poppy fields without any long-term risk to the environment, the soil or the local population. And yet those in control of operations over there have steadfastly refused to issue the order to destroy the heroin trade. They say they don't want to destroy the heroin trade because it would undermine our war effort if they did so. They say it would deprive the Afghans of a means of earning a living and therefore turn them against us. But most people who have studied this situation think that this is the most ludicrous piece of propaganda that has ever been issued. The heroin trade is the major source of income for our enemies, and it's therefore a major obstacle in us achieving our war aims. No, most experts suspect very strongly that the real reason why the heroin trade is not destroyed is because of corruption. The suspicion is that a large portion of the profits, and the profits from the heroin trade are astronomical. According to the UN, they put those profits at around $65 billion a year, and that's a conservative estimate. And the suspicion is that a portion of these profits have found their way into the pockets of people in the Pentagon and the White House and elsewhere, and that's why they refuse to destroy the heroin trade. But in the final analysis, whatever the excuse, there is no excuse. Our leaders have allowed these monsters to destroy our children on an industrial scale, and heroin does destroy people. To compare heroin with any other drug is like comparing the common cold to cancer. Heroin completely strips a human being of their dignity, their humanity, and eventually their very lives. It reduces human beings to zombie-like creatures who spend their days either zonked out in some semi-comatose stupor or desperately rooting around doing anything they can to get money for their next fix. And there is no depth to which a heroin addict will not sink to get his next fix. Prostitute themselves, beg, steal, borrow, anything at all. And I think it says all anybody ever needs to know about the character of our leaders, that they allow these ruthless human parasites to inflict this horror upon us when they could so easily put a stop to their activities. But I'm not making this video because I want to slag off our leaders, much as they deserve slagging off. I'm making this video because I want to appeal to the middle classes to end the conspiracy of silence that surrounds this issue. I want to ask the generals, the journalists and the judges, the bankers and the bishops, the politicians, the professors and the princes, and all those upon whom the very powerful rely, to speak out. When the middle classes finally did speak out about the slave trade, the powerful had to act. If the middle classes would speak out about the heroin trade, the powerful would have to act. Now, destroying the heroin trade would not rid the world of all the problems associated with addictive behaviour, but it would be a massive step in the right direction. It would save millions and millions and millions of people from lives of utter suffering, misery and early death, and not just the heroin addicts, but their families, their friends and their communities. So I ask you, please end the conspiracy of silence and speak out.